My 68th birthday fell on a Thursday, which I remember because I'd taken the whole week off work. Retired 3 years by then, but I still thought of time in terms of work weeks. Old habits. Margaret had been gone for 2 years at that point, and I won't pretend the birthday didn't sting a little on its own. She used to make a lemon cake from scratch, the kind with the real zest in the batter, and she'd leave it on the counter with a card that always said something embarrassingly sincere. I'd given her grief about those cards for 30 years. I'd have given anything to read one more. But I had Ethan, my son, 41 years old, lived 20 minutes away in Oakville. Worked at the engineering firm I'd spent 26 years building from a 2-person consultancy, in a rented office above a dry cleaner on Lakeshore Road, into something worth being proud of. I'd handed him the operations director role 4 years before I stepped back, eased him into it the way you ease someone into cold water. Slowly, with patience, with the belief that they'll thank you for it eventually. He called me that Tuesday, before my birthday. Said he was sorry, he had a client dinner on Thursday, couldn't get out of it, some infrastructure project the firm was bidding on out in Mississauga. I said that was fine. It was fine. I understood. Business was business. I'd used that same excuse myself more times than I cared to count when Ethan was young, and Margaret had never once thrown it back at me, so I wasn't about to throw it at him now. I made a reservation for one at a steakhouse in Burlington, a place called Carnwood, dark wood and leather booths, the kind of restaurant where they bring the bread without you asking. I'd taken Margaret there for our anniversary 2 or 3 times. I figured I'd have a proper meal, a glass of Malbec, maybe 2, and call it a reasonable evening. I drove myself, parked in the lot off Brant Street, walked in just before 7. The host was a young woman who asked if I was joining a party, and I said no, just myself, reservation under Whitfield. She walked me through the main room toward a smaller side section near the back, and I followed her past the booths along the window. And that's when I saw them. Ethan, seated at a booth by the far window. Across from him his wife Sabrina, and beside her, Sabrina's mother Greta. They had wine already, a bread basket, half eaten. Greta was laughing at something. Ethan had his jacket off, his tie loosened. He looked relaxed in a way that told me this dinner had been planned for a while. He saw me at almost the same moment I saw him. The smile dropped. I remember very clearly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt, not yet. It was something quieter and colder than either of those things. It was the particular feeling you get when something confirms a worry you'd been pushing down for months, trying to convince yourself was unfounded. I held up one hand in a small wave, smiled, kept walking to my table. The host seated me around the corner, out of their direct line of sight, which was either luck or the universe being polite. I ordered a glass of water and sat with the menu for a few minutes without reading it. I could hear Ethan excuse himself. A minute later he was standing at my table. "Dad," he said it in the tone of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was now improvising badly. "I didn't know you were coming here. It's my birthday," I said. "I made a reservation." I know. The client dinner got moved last minute, and Sabrina had already planned this with her mother. I looked at him. He was a good-looking man, my son. He had Margaret's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that shifted depending on the light. Right now they were not shifting, they were just uncertain. "Ethan," I said, "go enjoy your dinner. Dad, go on." He went. I ate my steak alone. It was a good steak. The Malbec was better than I'd expected. I left a generous tip, drove home on the QEW with the radio off, and sat in the kitchen for a long time before going to bed. That was the first night I started to understand that something was changing, and that it wasn't just Margaret's absence making the house feel strange. I should tell you something about the company before I go further, because it matters. Whitfield Engineering had contracts with 3 municipalities, a standing relationship with 2 of the largest development firms in the GTA, and, as of the previous spring, a pending acquisition offer from a Calgary-based infrastructure group called Tarrant Capital. It was a serious offer, $14 million for a controlling stake, with provisions for the remaining minority shareholders, which at that point included me, Ethan, and my longtime partner and CFO, a man named Russell, who had been with me since year 4. I had told Ethan I was considering it. I had not told him. I was leaning toward accepting. I I had also not told him that I had quietly asked Russell to compile an audit of the past 18 months of financials before I made any decision, because a few things in the quarterly summaries hadn't quite added up, and I'd learned long ago to trust that feeling. Russell called me in early October, about 3 weeks after the birthday dinner. "I need to come see you," he said. "Not at the office." We met at my kitchen table. He brought a printed binder. I made coffee. He set the binder down and didn't open it right away. "I want to preface this by saying I may be wrong," he said. "I want that on record before we talk." "Noted," I said. Talk. What Russell had found, or believed he'd found, hedging carefully as accountants do, was a pattern of small, irregular disbursements over the past 14 months routed through a vendor account that had been set up about a year and a half ago. A company called Briarfield Consulting. No website. A registered address in Hamilton that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. Invoices that described services, strategic advisory, market analysis. In language vague enough to mean almost anything or nothing at all. The disbursements, individually, were small enough not to trigger the internal review threshold. Cumulatively, they added up to just over $230,000. I sat with that number for a moment. "Who set up the vendor account?" I asked. Russell looked at the binder. Operations. Operations was Ethan's department. I drank my coffee. Russell drank his. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the ravine behind the houses. A squirrel, probably. It always was. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Nothing yet. I wanted you to know before I went any further. If I'm wrong, I've wasted a weekend and we never speak of it again. If I'm not, keep going," I said, quietly. He nodded. He took the binder with him when he left. I don't think I slept more than 4 hours that night. I lay in the dark in the house Margaret, and I had bought in 1991, in the bedroom where she'd spent her last months, and I thought about the birthday dinner. I thought about the way Ethan had said last minute when he explained why the client dinner had moved. I thought about Greta, Sabrina's mother, who had always been pleasant to my face and whom I had never quite trusted in the private, unexamined way you sometimes don't trust a person without being able to say exactly why. Sabrina had been good for Ethan when they met. I'd thought so at the time. She was sharp, organized, the kind of person who could walk into a room and assess it in 30 seconds. But sharp people can cut in more than one direction, and organized people can organize things you never asked them to organize. I thought about something Ethan had said at Christmas 2 years ago, offhand, something about the firm's structure being complicated now that I was less involved. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Retirement brings its own awkward transitions. I'd filed it away and moved on. Now I was pulling it back out. Over the next 6 weeks, I made a deliberate decision about how to behave. I would not confront Ethan. Not yet. I would not let him know that anything had changed. I would be exactly what he perhaps believed. I was slowly becoming a 68-year-old widower who came into the office once a week, who asked the same questions twice sometimes, who had started leaving his reading glasses in the wrong rooms. A man gently fading from relevance. I was not fading, I was watching. I had Russell working quietly through the vendor account records. I retained a lawyer, not the firm's lawyer, a separate one, a woman named Isabel, who had done some estate work for me years ago, and who I trusted completely. I told her what I had and asked her to tell me what I might be looking at. She called me back 2 days later. "If what your accountant found holds up," she said, "you're looking at potential fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, possibly more, depending on whether the disbursements were the only mechanism." "What else might there be?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Have you looked at the Tarrant Capital negotiation closely? Who's been handling it on your side?" I had handed the preliminary discussions to Ethan 6 months ago, because I had genuinely thought, that it was a good opportunity for him to step into a leadership role on a major deal. A gift, really. Something to point to. "Pull those files," Isabel said, "and pull anything related to the shareholder structure discussions." I pulled them. "I'm going to tell you what I found, and I'm going to tell it plainly because there's no way to soften it that wouldn't be an insult to the truth." Ethan had been in conversation with Tarrant Capital's acquisition team about a revised deal structure. One that would, in the transition period, shift my residual shareholder rights to a holding entity. The holding entity had two named officers. One was Ethan. The other was a numbered company registered in Alberta with no public-facing directors, but which, through one layer of corporate structure, connected back to a numbered company in Ontario, in which Sabrina Whitfield was a 50% owner. He hadn't finalized anything. He couldn't, without my signature, but he'd been building toward it for the better part of a year, apparently on the belief that by the time the deal reached the stage where my signature was needed, I might not be in any position to understand what I was signing. The assessment. About 8 months earlier, Ethan had suggested, very gently, that I speak to my family doctor about some memory concerns he said he'd noticed. I had gone, because I try to be sensible about health. The doctor, a perfectly good GP in Burlington I'd been seeing for 6 years, had referred me to a specialist for a routine cognitive screen. I'd done the screen. The results had been, as I understood it, entirely normal for my age. Ethan had told me the results were, quote, a little concerning. He'd said the specialist had flagged some things to watch for. He'd suggested, again very gently, that it might be worth having him added to my banking correspondence, just to keep an eye on things. I had said I'd think about it. I thought about it rather differently now. I requested my full medical records from the specialist. What they showed was exactly what I'd remembered. A normal result. Nothing flagged. No recommendations beyond standard annual follow-up. Whatever Ethan had told Sabrina, or Greta, or Tarrant Capital, had not come from that report. I want to be honest about what the weeks after that felt like. I've been asked since whether I was angry. The answer is yes, but it's not the whole answer. Angry doesn't capture the specific texture of realizing that your child, a child you carried on your shoulders at Canada's Wonderland, a child you drove to hockey at 5:15 in the morning, every Saturday from September through March for 7 years, a child whose university application you edited until 2 in the morning, has been methodically working to take something from you by convincing the world you're no longer competent to hold it. There's a particular kind of grief in that. It's not like losing Margaret. Nothing was like losing Margaret, but it was grief of a sort, the loss of a story you'd been telling yourself about who your family was. I kept coming to the office once a week. I kept asking the same questions twice. I left a coffee mug on Ethan's desk one afternoon, and then came back 20 minutes later and asked him if he'd seen my mug, pointing at it while it was right there. He was very patient with me. He was quite gentle. I made sure to be touched by his patience. Russell had finished his work by mid-November. The total in fraudulent disbursements was $241,000. He had documentation for every transaction. Isabel had the shareholder structure analysis completed a week later. She had also, on her own initiative and without billing me for it, reached out to a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse law in Ontario. She said she wanted me to understand the full scope of what I could do. I sat in her office and listened to her lay it out. When she was finished, I asked her one question. Can we do this in a way where he doesn't see it coming until it's already done? She looked at me over her glasses. Yes, she said, we can. The Tarrant Capital deal had moved to the stage where both sides were to meet in person to initial the term sheet before proceeding to final documentation. Ethan had organized the meeting. It was scheduled for a Tuesday in December at the firm's offices, a boardroom on the 4th floor with a view of the escarpment that I'd always liked. Present would be 2 representatives from Tarrant, myself, Ethan Russell, and the firm's corporate lawyer. Ethan had also invited Sabrina. He said she'd been closely involved in the preliminary discussions, and it made sense for her to be there. I said that sounded fine. He did not invite Greta. I mention this because I want to be fair. The morning of the meeting, before anyone arrived, I met briefly with Isabel in the parking garage. She handed me a sealed envelope and told me what to do with it. I put it in my jacket pocket. Ethan arrived first, then Sabrina, then the Tarrant representatives. 2 men, efficient and pleasant, the kind of people who'd done dozens of these meetings. Russell came in last, set up his laptop, poured himself a water. He didn't look at me differently than usual. We'd practiced this. We spent the first 40 minutes on routine matters. The term sheet, the transition timeline, the retention arrangements for key staff. Ethan walked through the structure with confidence. He was good at this, I'll give him that. He knew the firm's numbers. He'd learned from me, after all. Then we reached the ownership structure section. Ethan pulled up a slide that showed the proposed post-acquisition shareholder framework. There was my name, there was Ethan's name, and there was the holding entity I'd discovered 2 months earlier, listed. Now that we were in a formal meeting, in plain language on a projected slide for everyone in the room to see. I waited until he finished explaining it. Then I said, "I'm sorry, could you explain that holding company again? I want to make sure I understand it correctly." Ethan explained it again, patiently, simply, the way you explain something to someone who might need a moment to follow along. "And Sabrina's company is a part of that structure?" I asked. A pause. Not long, just a beat. "There's a related entity, yes, for tax efficiency," Sabrina said smoothly. "It's quite standard." I nodded slowly. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope. I slid it across the table to the lead Tarrant representative. "Before we go further," I said, "I'd like you to read what's in that envelope." The room went very quiet. The envelope contained a 4-page summary, prepared by Isabel and Russell together, of the fraudulent vendor disbursements, the documentation trail, the shareholder structure analysis, the discrepancy between my actual cognitive assessment results and what had apparently been communicated to third parties, and a letter from Isabel advising that her client, me, had retained counsel and intended to pursue all available legal remedies, and further advising any prospective business partners that entering into a transaction involving contested ownership interests could expose them to significant liability. The Tarrant representative read it. He passed it to his colleague. His colleague read it. Neither of them looked at Ethan. The meeting lasted another 12 minutes. The Tarrant representative said that they would need to consult with their legal team before any further discussions. They were professional and polite about it. They shook my hand on the way out. They did not shake Ethan's. After they left, the room was very quiet for a moment. Ethan said, "Dad, don't," I said. Sabrina started to say something. I looked at her and she stopped. I looked at my son. He looked like a man who had just watched a building he'd spent a year constructing come apart in 12 minutes. He looked, underneath the shock, very young, younger than 41. For a moment I could see the boy he'd been, and that was the hardest part of the whole day. Harder than any of the rest of it. "I have spoken to Isabel Marsh," I said. "You know who she is. She has the full documentation. The next steps are going to depend on choices you make in the next 48 hours. I suggest you get your own lawyer before you make those choices." I picked up my jacket. I said goodbye to Russell. I walked out of the boardroom, down 4 flights of stairs, because I've never liked elevators, and out into the parking lot, where the December air was sharp and clean, and the sky above the escarpment was the particular shade of pale gray that it gets just before snow. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting it. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said. She wouldn't have been surprised, I don't think. She'd had a cooler read on Sabrina than I did, from early on, and she'd said once, years ago, something about Ethan needing to decide who he was when he was away from me. I'd thought she meant it as a general observation about adulthood. Maybe she did. Maybe she meant more than that. I thought about the lemon cake, the sincere cards. I started the car. I won't pretend the months that followed were easy, or that this is a story where everything resolves cleanly, and everyone learns their lesson, and we all go back to being a family at Christmas. Ethan retained a lawyer. There were negotiations. The fraudulent disbursements were repaid, all $241,000, plus interest, in a structured arrangement that his lawyer negotiated down from criminal referral in exchange for full restitution and Ethan's resignation from the company. Isabel was firm on the resignation. I was firm on the restitution. Those were the 2 things I would not move on. The Tarrant Capital deal collapsed. That was a real loss, financially speaking, and I won't minimize it. $14 million that didn't materialize is $14 million. But Tarrant had been buying partly on the strength of Ethan's continued involvement, and that was no longer on the table, and their appetite for the complexity of what had come out was understandably limited. Russell and I hired a new operations director in the spring, a woman from a competitor firm, smart and straightforward, who had no history with any of us. The company steadied. Ethan and I have not spoken much. We've spoken. There were 2 conversations in the first month that were painful in the specific way that only conversations with your own child can be painful. A pain that doesn't map onto anything else in human experience, that I don't have adequate language for. He said things. I said things. Some of it was true and necessary. Some of it was just grief moving through 2 people who didn't know what to do with it. I don't know what his marriage looks like now. That's not my business. What I do know is this. I wake up every morning in the house on Ravenswood Drive, in the bedroom where Margaret's reading lamp still sits on the nightstand because I haven't been able to move it, and I make my coffee and I sit at the kitchen table where Russell once spread out a binder and told me he might be wrong, and I think about what it means to have built something. Not just a company. A life. 38 years of marriage. A son. A neighborhood where people wave at you from their driveways. A reputation that you earn slowly, the way you earn anything that's actually worth having. Those things don't vanish because someone tries to take them. That's what I didn't know before, or didn't know well enough. I thought the taking was the danger. It turns out the taking only works if you let yourself believe you're already gone. I'm still here. I made a lemon cake last February, the first time I'd ever made one from scratch. It took me 3 attempts over 2 weekends to get the zest ratio right. The third one was actually quite good. I ate it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I told Margaret out loud that she should have written down the recipe, which is something she would have found very funny. I think she would have.